These are dark times. For some of us, they always have been. Yet there is resilience in our places, wisdom in our streets, the desire to resist, to care, to be together again. We can harness this critical moment. Our stories of ruin, resistance, and renewal will light the way forward. Join us at the SF Urban Film Fest.
Good afternoon and welcome to the 7th annual SF Urban Film Fest. We're on our last day of an amazing week, and this is our last event, but last is not least. My name is Faye Darmawi, and I'm the founder and executive director of the SF Urban Film Fest. Our mission is to use film and storytelling to inspire conversation and action around urban issues. In addition to Crystal, who I'll bring on to the stage in a moment, our SF Urban Film Fest core team includes Ron Sundstrom, our Humanities advisor, and who will moderate our panel today. Our core team also includes program producers Robin Abad, Omid Manicheri, and Susanna Smith. In addition, I'd like to give a shout out to our marketing guru, Hannah Moore, and a big thank you to all our volunteers. And now here's Crystal.
Hi, everyone. I'm Crystal Chelik. I'm festival manager and co-curator of tonight's program, along with Ron Sundstrom, who I will bring on in a moment. Welcome to the panel discussion of Where the Pavement Ends. If you haven't viewed the film yet, you still have until midnight tonight. Simply purchase a sliding scale rental pass via our website. The link is in the chat. I'd now like to offer a land acknowledgement gifted to us from our friends at the American Indian Cultural District. The SF Urban Film Fest acknowledges that we are on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone, who are the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. They have never ceded, lost, nor forgotten their responsibilities as the caretakers of this place and for all people who reside here. As guests, we recognize that we benefit from being on their traditional homeland and wish to pay our respects by acknowledging the ancestors, elders, and relatives of the Ramaytush community and by affirming their sovereign rights as First Peoples. We're presenting this land acknowledgement to promote visibility for the Ramaytush Ohlone and all American Indians living and thriving today on their ancestral homelands. Our panel will begin after a few announcements from Faye.
Hi again. First, I want to let everybody know that today's program is being recorded. I'd also like to thank you in advance for your patience, as we know unpredictable things may happen as we're also getting used to our virtual events. Please leave a message in the comment box if you have any issues. Also, I would like to thank all our members joining us this afternoon. And if you'd like to keep our community growing and become a member, it's easy to do so via our website. We're dropping the link to the website in our chat. Also, our festival this year is Pay What You Can, so that all can access our programs. If you'd like to donate and keep this offering possible by offsetting our costs, please donate via the link in the chat. And lastly, for me, please fill out a quick survey using the link on the screen or in the comments. It's important that we get as many survey responses as possible so that we can understand who we're reaching and make sure that we're reaching a diverse and wonderful audience. And now back to Crystal.
Thanks, Faye. The elements of a city serve many functions: homes to house people, buildings for our commercial activity, streets and avenues to channel and facilitate our movement, and parks and boulevards for us to relax and play in and to stroll. These elements also are used to mark off neighborhoods and other urban areas. They gather us in, but they also serve to exclude and demarcate those who belong from those who do not. It is no coincidence then that racial divisions play out and are reinforced in concrete and asphalt. The concrete seams demarcating communities are often sites of conflict and brutality when they're policed to fortify separation. But we also know that possibilities exist at these seams. Possibilities for confrontation, for protest, and for asserting that all have the right to the city. I'm so honored to have our three panelists join us today to discuss these themes. And I'd now like to welcome my co-curator of this program, our moderator for tonight, Ron Sundstrom, who is professor of philosophy at the University of San Francisco and SF Urban Film Fest's Humanities advisor.
Thank you, Crystal and Faye. Hello out there. Again, I'm Ron Sundstrom, the Humanities advisor for the SF Urban Film Fest. Fantastic. It's a great pleasure to be here today with you and to introduce to you each of our wonderful panelists. So first up is Jane Gillooly. She's a filmmaker, a Guggenheim Fellow, and creator of the film Where the Pavement Ends. In addition to her art practice, she is a professor at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts at Tufts University. Jane.
So I am so happy to be here, and I'm really honored to have my film screen in this festival, and it's just fantastic, and I wish I could be there. So next year, maybe this will all change. So I just thought I'd introduce myself, tell you a little bit about myself and my work, and starting with what Ron said, is I identify as both a filmmaker and an artist, and also an educator. I'm not sure which one is more important in my life, but I am particularly interested in the art of narrative. And what draws me to subject matter are the topics that I choose is always when history, politics, and personal struggle collide. Stylistically, my work is very different from one piece to another. And although there's obvious similarities in terms of my approach, you could say that I'm open to sort of a certain type of content where I'm compelled by projects that have a strong narrative component and frequently a social issue origin. I sometimes find it easier to describe my work by what it's not. My films are provocative more than they're didactic. They're controversial more than they're political. They're inspired by worthy causes, I think, while they're not exactly activist films. And I'm dedicated to my role as a filmmaker over any aspiration of changing opinion. So to give you like an idea of the content, the range of topics, I mean, I have worked on films with women in prison and HIV/AIDS, reproductive rights, biographical film about a daughter's loss of her father, films about caretakers in Swaziland and southern India, a hybrid narrative about an illicit love affair that was sourced from audio tapes that were purchased on eBay, and then the most recent work that we'll refer to today, Where the Pavement Ends. Briefly, for those of you who may not have seen it, I am going to talk more about the film, of course, but the film examines two towns in Missouri, Kinloch and Ferguson, Missouri, who shared a history and a very deep racial divide. And I grew up in Ferguson, Missouri. I had started a short film based on a childhood memory that I had from Ferguson prior to the murder of Mike Brown. Of course, I needed to reconsider the work that I had done up until that point. And I went back to the drawing board, so to speak, to think about what kind of film should I be making at that moment. I also then begun a collaboration with the other filmmakers in the work, Kari Jones and Aparna Agrawal. And I felt like I went from, not that I was making a personal film to begin with, but I felt like I needed an outside perspective. And so I just want to acknowledge the work that both of them brought tremendous talent to this project. And the film grew to a feature and began to encompass more about about Kinloch and its relationship to Ferguson than it did originally. So I'm going to leave it there.
Well, thank you, Jane. Thank you very much. Next up is Dr. Brandi Summers. Professor Summers is an assistant professor of geography and global metropolitan studies, GMS, at the University of California, Berkeley, and author of Back in Place, The Spatial Aesthetics of Race in a Post-Chocolate City, right? So Brandi, would you like to tell us a little bit about your work?
Sure. Thank you so much, Ron. And I want to also thank Faye, Cristal, and Omid for being really wonderful through this whole process. I'm the closest to everyone here for the festival. I'm just over the bridge in Berkeley, California. But again, I'm happy to be here. I'm from Oakland originally, so I'm very familiar with the area. But again, I'm really happy to be here and to be in conversation about this James' wonderful film. Just a little bit about me and my work. Yes, I'm a professor at UC Berkeley. And overall, you know, I'm really asking questions about urban genealogies, like, and how profit has been made through the dispossession and displacement of Black people throughout history, and really thinking about the ways that there's been this commodification of Black culture that's really linked to the production of space under capitalism. And so more specifically for Black in Place, I was looking at Washington, D.C., particularly at this historically Black rapidly gentrifying or gentrified commercial corridor, and really trying to detail how we've made this move from DC being a chocolate city, one that had a large or majority Black population, to becoming this diverse cosmopolitan metropolis. And so I'm talking about this changing historical role of Blackness and its interaction, Blackness's interaction with processes of gentrification. And so with that, you know, I still think about Blackness as the central analytic to understand how racism shapes Black life, but then also how, like, there are these liberal proclamations of race neutrality that call for diversity, but that those calls for diversity only end up serving to marginalize and displace Black people. So for the next project, I'm actually shifting locations and moving to the West Coast to talk about Oakland. The pandemic has definitely shifted my thinking about how I do research here, but ultimately, you know, I'm still working with this concept and thinking about Blackness, and still arguing that Blackness is central to the experience and materiality of the city. And so really, you know, there may be fewer Black cities in the sense that we previously understood them in terms of there being, you know, majority Black populations, but the remnants become especially clear when there's a crisis. You know, Black cities are the ones that burn first. They're the ones that have the strongest militarized police presence. They're the ones where protesters, as we've seen, are harassed and arrested. They're the locations where curfews are enacted first. And these cities have been these containers for boundless oppression and segregation. And they're the ones that continue to use Black people to keep them running. And so this book, as I'm, you know, still doing the research and writing, is really a way to try to figure out, like, what do Black people do in response? What kinds of strategies are enacted to run up against this same machine? And how are the creative ways and prolific ways that Black people are able to survive under these contexts? So that's a little bit about my work, but thank you again.
Fantastic, Brandi. Thank you so much. Okay, next up is Tonika Johnson. Tonika is a photographer and social justice artist from Chicago's South Side neighborhood of Inglewood. She is the creator of the Folded Map Project, which has evolved into a multimodal advocacy and policy influencing tool. Right? Okay, Tonika, would you like to tell us a little bit about your work?
Yes, Folded Map is the project that has, you know, received most recognition, not only in the city, but in other cities that are segregated as a tool for possible connectivity to help people personalize this issue of segregation in a way that historic policy has not been able to prevent. So my project just offers an opportunity for people to really reflect on how segregation has impacted their daily lives, not just the people who have been most negatively impacted, but all of us. We're all segregated, not just people of color, all of us. So in order to kind of help people understand what Folded Map is about, I would like to just show a short clip, and hopefully that will help people understand.
You know, as projects progress, it just naturally evolved into me one day asking one resident if they wanted to meet their map twin resident, and they said yes. And I was like, oh my gosh, what am I going to have them talk about?
That was like a genuine connection, right? It was like nothing forced or fake. We had a conversation, learn each other's differences in community. The things that I talked about or maybe spoke about that I would like to see here in Inglewood, they already had out there when we spoke, to know that they couldn't even imagine being in the community, not having the things that, I guess, basic necessities. So yeah, it was interesting.
I guess it is really striking, you know, how lucky we are. And we certainly don't think of ourselves as living in a rich neighborhood, but compared to some, we are very privileged. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Thank you. What amazing collection of artists and activists and scholars we have with us today. Fantastic. So let's jump into the deep end, shall we? When we're talking about space, we're talking about place, we're talking about segregation in particular, not just residential educational segregation. We're talking about social spatial segregation here, the division of people. So for each of you, what do you see when you see segregation? Right, Jane, let's start with you. In particular, maybe you can answer that question and tell us how your film project came about.
Yeah, sure. You know, as I mentioned, I grew up in Ferguson, about a mile from the Kinloch border. And this film actually has a somewhat lengthy backstory, but I do want to abbreviate it because I think it's important in my personal connection to the to the project. So the idea for the film originated from a memory I had as a child when I was living in, you know, this divided community, which I realized that even that phrase, that term, divided community, is so euphemistic for what was essentially, you know, for Ferguson for most of the last century was essentially a sundown town. And although there's not explicit laws on the books that I could find in my research that, you know, prohibited Blacks from traveling in and out of the city after dark, the behavior of white police and the residents in the town certainly made it clear that people of color weren't welcome. And in Ferguson's case, they physically prevented access to the town through a road called Suburban Avenue by both erecting dead-end streets and barricades at the end of that road. And so the initial idea on this film came about because I had a memory of the dispute over the road as a kid, and how the road had been blocked off between the two towns. And in 1968, after Martin Luther King was killed, a memorial march was planned, and the people, the residents of Kinloch, dismantled the barrier so that they could walk down from Kinloch down Suburban Avenue into Ferguson. And my mother took me and me and some of my siblings on this march. So I was young enough at the time that I wasn't quite sure, where I was and what was happening, but it made this really huge impression on me. And, as an adult, I decided to try to find out like what that event was. And so I started researching the event at some point, like decades after I moved away from home. And the original film that I thought about making was just going to be like a short animated film that was going to focus on the events of that particular day and how the barrier came down and people, marched down Suburban Avenue. And in the process of telling the story of that one event, I could address the segregation and the existence of Ferguson being a sundown town. So then in 2012, and this was 2 years before Mike Brown was killed, I happened to drive through Kinloch, and I was really shocked to discover that almost all the buildings had been torn down. Mm-hmm. And the destruction of the buildings had started at some point in the 90s, but I had moved away and I was completely unaware. And so when I realized that the town had almost vanished, I felt this real sense of urgency that I should really start, filming what was left. Mm-hmm. And I started thinking about how, or if it was going to be possible to incorporate the disappearance of the town into this original idea that I had for this animated film project. And then in 2014, as everyone knows, Mike Brown was murdered. So some of you may remember that the original confrontation between Brown and the police officer began when Darren Wilson told Mike Brown that he was jaywalking and he needed to get out of the street. And we all know that this escalated unnecessarily and ended in Mike Brown's murder. I actually stopped working on my short film at that time. I felt like it just suddenly seemed very unimportant to be talking about this somewhat peaceful memorial march that had happened in 1968, considering what had just happened in 2014. But eventually I started to think about the metaphor of the road and how the inability for Blacks in Ferguson to move freely throughout the town, mm-hmm. and how these two events were somewhat linked, right? Mm-hmm. And a disputed road blockade on one street on one side of Ferguson, and almost a half a century later, the killing of Mike Brown on Canfield Drive. They were somehow linked in my mind and forever, of course, shaped the identity of the town. And so I wanted to figure out a way to work on this film where I could parallel these two moments in history. And so the film grew out of what I thought was really an important way to look at the prehistory of segregation and racial injustice in Ferguson, mm-hmm. and how that absolutely led in a way to the events that led up to Mike Brown's death, and that that killing did not happen in a vacuum. So I don't know if that gets to your question, but that's where the whole thing started. And like I said, I started working with some other filmmakers who obviously didn't grow up in Ferguson with me and didn't have my same childhood memories or my same links or links to the town, or my sort of like muddled memories of the town because I had been gone for so long, so that we could sort of tease it apart and really look at the relationship between these two locations.
Great, thank you so much. Tonika, your folded map project comes to mind when thinking about this question about how you see segregation. So, you know, you got your great art project. So what do you see? What does your project help us see when you and we see segregation?
Oh,
Sorry,
you're muted.
Tonika, you're muted.
So sorry. Oftentimes I joke with people and tell them, you know, when they ask, how did you come up with this project? And I tell them, well, it really is my autobiography, just encapsulated in several different mediums. Which then led me to even create my short animated film explaining the project and its origin, because me being a young Black girl, 13 years old, disrupting segregation, having to go to a better quality school in a predominantly white neighborhood that was 15 miles away from me, um, exposed me to navigating space in a way that showed me something that I didn't understand. I just knew, like, okay, this where I live looks different than where my high school is. And then, you know, the added benefit of, you know, Chicago having a unique grid map, you know, we have streets that extend the entire city. And so I was able to make the connection at 13, 14 while traveling on public transportation every morning. Like, oh, this street does not look the same as it does next to my high school. And so, you know, my exposure to navigating space, like a lot of teenagers of color in the 90s in Chicago, specifically before GPS, before cell phones, we had to understand geography and space. And then we had to navigate it. And the things that we were exposed to in that process hinted at, like, something larger is happening here, you know, because you make friends with people in different neighborhoods, especially in your high school years, and especially that beautiful decade of the 90s in Chicago where hip hop was really thriving. You know, you were exposed to the diversity of Chicago, but you also realized it was so segregated. So even though we were in, like, disrupting it and creating our own integrated spaces and introducing each other to our segregated spaces, we realized it was, you know, problematic, and that it was something larger going on. So that observation just stuck with me, and it really helped me understand as I became older how segregation and how it impacts our lived experience. And I was just constantly getting reminded of how it impacts at every stage of my life. And so ultimately, after going through my early 20s, becoming a new homeowner, returning to the neighborhood that I grew up in because of segregation and my inability to be able to afford another neighborhood that I enjoyed, brought me back to my home neighborhood as an adult. And that's when I was able to look at everything through a different lens that will ultimately lead me to create Folded Map, which is a way for people to understand how the built environment demonstrates the history if we pay attention to it. And if we pay attention to it, we can understand or begin to see how it really interrupts our social networks. Because Chicago isn't, you know, like DC, a chocolate city. It is literally equally diverse. But you wouldn't think so in certain spaces. Within the arts, we integrate a lot, but we don't have enough spaces, physical built spaces, where that diversity happens as much as our city reflects it, you know? And so that is what ultimately led me to create Folded Map, where it combines exposing the issue while also offering a solution.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Brandi, your scholarship directly relates to this question about what we see when we see segregation, you know, and so we'd love to know, right? What have you discovered? What have you come upon in your scholarship that directly relates to this question as well? What do you see when you see segregation?
I'll apologize now. My connection has been weirdly unstable, so hopefully I can get through. I thank you both, Jane and Tonika, for your responses. I think for all of us, there's a personal element to this. I think and actually echoing what Jane said about, roads and thinking about roads, the first time I recognized segregation, at least in Oakland, had to do with the division of the freeways. And, whether or highway or road, where it's, highway 13, 580, 880, and what kinds of neighborhoods were between them. And I started to recognize these class differences that also were mapped upon these racial differences. And so at the time, I wasn't really familiar growing up, not knowing what that meant. I just knew that between the freeways, there were different populations, right? And so as I got older and moved to different areas in the country, again, a lot of people think that California, especially the Bay Area, is this liberal bastion of just like freedom and everyone, gets along really well. And then you move to other parts of the country. I moved to Philadelphia and was in West Philadelphia and saw the ways that Philadelphia was incredibly segregated, and how institutions, especially private institutions or universities, played a large role in terms of how specifically Black people were able to live in the city. I lived in Chicago for 8 years as well. And so I was seeing in Chicago that divide with the South Side, the West Side, and the North Side. And it was just very clear. You didn't have to see a person. You could literally look at the built environment. You could look at the landscape. Chicago spends a lot of money making sure it's pretty downtown, and the plants are changed seasonally. And so same thing with DC. You see that 95+% of the population east of the river in Ward 7 and 8, where I still have a home, is Black. And so you start to see the ways that the wards start to determine how you can live and where you can live. So of course, there's this longer history of redlining. If we think about real estate practices and the ways that the federal government was absolutely not only involved, but responsible for this division in terms of where people could live as it related to race. We saw this predicated through restrictive covenants and the fact that certain ethnic groups, specifically Black people, but also Chinese, Japanese, Jews, a number of different groups were unable to move into certain neighborhoods, and the white people that own the homes couldn't sell to them at the same time. And so segregation has this very clear history as it being very direct and very specific to not allowing people to live in, again, neighborhoods, a residential element. But we're still starting to see the remnants of it, just in terms of a lack of ability to accumulate wealth because people couldn't buy homes in these areas that have their property values have risen. There have been recent stories. I just showed my students a video from Marin City where there was a Black family who bought a home and they renovated it, spent $400,000 in renovations, and the real estate appraisal came back incredibly low. When they had a friend of theirs, a white woman, come in and essentially say that the home was hers, the value doubled in terms of the real estate appraisal. So we're starting to see these ways that wealth or lack thereof is absolutely still connected to Black skin. And at the same time, we're seeing these ways that value is also determined by who you are, where you're from. And so segregation doesn't necessarily have to be written in law for it to still continue. And we're seeing it in these really meaningful ways. And, I know we're going to talk a bit about, how we can not only see it, let's say in Jane's film, or even thinking about Tonika's project and the way that you can literally fold this map of this grid and recognize how distinct it is visually. But there's also sound. You can hear different sounds in different neighborhoods, tastes in different neighborhoods. So segregation really kind of plays on the growth and development of neighborhoods, whether you can actually have a neighborhood or call yourself as being a part of a community, versus buying a home, sitting on it and selling it with the hopes to gain a huge profit, right? So we're seeing this shift not only in geographies because of this racial difference, but segregated, uneven geographies being built through these practices.
Fantastic answer. So what I'm getting from all three of you is that these lines of segregation that we experience are laid out in concrete and asphalt in the built environment. But not only are these demarcations of separations, but they come to make life less possible, or they crush development in some areas while exacerbate it in others, right? It's really deep. So let's go into the granular. Brandi, your last question in particular really started getting into this, but I'm going to ask the question anyways, and maybe we can get more out of everyone. What are the factors that influenced, right, those pieces of your experience, right, that the factors of segregation that influence how you see and experience it? Jane, in particular, through your film, right? How would you answer this question, right, while making the film, and you know, what did you see, and how now after doing so, how has that changed the lens through which you see our social spatial divisions?
That's a really good question, and it was something that I felt I spent a lot of time really thinking about, actually, when I was researching the film. So, I mean, as most filmmakers know, like 95% of filmmaking is not out in the field. It's like it's writing and researching and sculpting and structuring what it is, the connections between what you're learning about a situation and how to put that on the screen. And so when I was researching about Kinloch, I discovered, again, you know, I did not know this growing up, that initially Kinloch was both a white and a Black community. And there was a time when the northern part of the city of Kinloch was not primarily white, but more white people were in the north, and the southern part of the town was primarily Black. They did share a school system, but for the most part, the kids in the north went to schools in the north, and the kids in the south went, you know, to schools in the south. There was some mixing, but at some point there was a fight over property tax, and white families didn't want their property taxes to go to schools that were predominantly for Black children, and they didn't necessarily want Black children to continue to go to the schools in the north part of the town where the white families lived, and so they voted to break off from the city of Kinloch and become a separate incorporated town called Berkeley. A little bit of history here about the metropolitan St. Louis is that you all probably heard after Mike Brown's death that metropolitan St. Louis is made up of something like 100 different little towns and villages and communities, and only some of them were incorporated towns. Some of them are unincorporated parts of the county, and it's kind of a hodgepodge of it's, well, I don't even want to go down that road right now, but it's very complex, the governance in metropolitan St. Louis. And so Kinloch could have remained an unincorporated section of the county, but at the time they decided that they wanted to incorporate because that would also allow them to become a self-governing town. And at the time, there was a lot of people who lived in Kinloch, and they were the largest like self-governing Black town in the United States for a certain while in the 50s and early 60s. So on the one hand, this was great because you hear people in the film talk about they felt safe there, they could make decisions for themselves. Kinloch was a strong and really vibrant community. They had most of everything they needed, partially because of segregation. Kinloch is adjacent to the St. Louis International Airport and an aeronautics company called, at the time it was McDonnell. And so there were quite a few, Black engineers and cartologists and different people who lived in Kinloch who had good paying jobs. And they, worked at McDonnell, but they couldn't buy necessarily homes anywhere outside of Kinloch because of redlining. So Kinloch, had doctors and dentists, and they were sort of a self-sufficient city for a while. but they weren't, but not all the, residents had white collar jobs, obviously. And so eventually the tax base really started to fail. And then once that happened, of course, the school system started to struggle, and then the city services in the town started to fail. And for the most part, when Berkeley broke off from Kinloch, they pretty much set Kinloch up to fail. And everyone kind of understands like that, whether that was a motive or not, it's really hard to say. But there was the city of Berkeley surrounded Kinloch, Ferguson on the other side. So Kinloch became a much smaller landmass. They were landlocked with little opportunity to grow. And so the demise really may have also started with their incorporation. And on to Brandi's point of the highway systems, Berkeley sort of situated themselves on one side of the highway so that the Kinloch was on the other side of the highway. And then if you look at early highway maps from the 1960s, you could already see that there were plans for other highways that were going to further isolate Kinloch, that were, you'd see these sort of red dotted lines on the highway map, so that you knew there was going to be a road that was going to cut through there. And so you could see how Kinloch was just being sort of like strangled in a way. And so, all of this, of course, becomes much more obvious when you're really teasing apart and looking at all the little pieces. But of course, my experience of it growing up was I didn't experience it. I lived in Ferguson. There were roads that we could get in and out of. We were a much larger town, and so it was hard to even compare one experience with the other. But you could see how segregation had predetermined whether a town was going to succeed or not. So that is all the kind of things I was discovering when I was making the film.
That's a fantastic answer. And it really reminds us about how the built environment, as all three of you were saying earlier, really influences these divisions and puts them into concrete around us. We're all too familiar with the freeway system and how it divides communities, isolates them, and destroys them, especially, right, if poor and poor communities of color in particular. Tonika, right, your folded project comes to mind here because you're breaking through, right? You're trying to break through those walls, right? Not let the concrete stop you. So what do you see? I mean, how does your project speak to this question, right? What are the factors that influence how you see and experience segregation? I'm sorry, Tonika, you're muted again.
Sorry. Both to Jane and Brandi's point of, them being able through their research to reflect on their personal experience.
Mm-hmm.
And then also for Brandi to just lay bare for us the fact that, you don't have to have segregation written into law anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't have to do that because segregation in itself has created a way for us to perpetuate it psychologically. And so, what I mean is through your social networks. If you were raised in Ferguson like Jane, you were a little white girl who wasn't aware of why she possibly didn't have friends who didn't look like her. And so that creates a different, reality or understanding, and kind of exclusion to what other people could be going through, not at her fault. Same with me, a little Black girl from Inglewood. Like, I would have had a non-diverse group of friends had I not gone to the high school that I went to. So, as you get older and you hopefully gain exposure to interacting with different people, you can understand how this built environment, this history, has really influenced how we even see and view and value each other. And I think Chicago is a great example of, bittersweet, a great example of how when people talk about geography, when they talk about a location, you know that they're talking about the people, so it's inextricably linked when you talk about a location and you're talking about people. And so I just want us to at least attempt to attack segregation by psychologically doing so, starting from that personal experience, really reflecting on why you don't know something or why your childhood was this specific way, because we're all operating in this system that was created before us. And so what I like to propose to Chicago people who interact with my work, because we're so segregated, but we disrupt it often in a variety of different ways. It's just those ways aren't exalted as a solution to what this city really needs. And so I just propose to people to think about, does Chicago's segregation today reflect how we want to interact? And if it doesn't, then we have to create the ways to disrupt it or to educate ourselves about how other people are experiencing the city, so we can, one, know what to advocate for. So one, we can just gain a better understanding about our city overall. But really, we have to build empathy. We have to. And, like Brandi was saying before, policy hasn't gotten us there. It's not going to get us there. But it starts with people and movements and people connecting with each other. I think about all of the movements that have really gotten us to actual laws changing, even the civil rights, even what the Black Panthers are trying to do. When they started, even Malcolm X, when they started expanding their consciousness to understanding solidarity amongst all people to create equity, that's when, all of the horrible division and assassinations, even Martin Luther King, really connecting to people. Like, they are tricking all of us, racist people from our history who built these laws and the structures in which we operate, even the appraisal. Like, once we can't even address or redress segregation through housing alone, because then you have to also dismantle the racism and built barriers within appraisal, within real estate, within, so in order to even attempt to do all that, we have to connect with each other. We have to understand how all of this has led to us having such different lived experiences that ultimately influence how we judge and value people. And so it just has to become personal.
That's an amazing answer. Not only do we use the built environment to divide ourselves from other people, but we really divide ourselves. We really divide inside of ourselves. That's like it comes to inhabit us, right? Mm-hmm. That's a fantastic answer. I mean, Tonika, your answer really illustrates how space itself, right? Our built environment can be demagogic. It can really mess with us and divide us. Brandi, your scholarship, right? Again, as you were responding to the earlier question, really, directly relates to this question. So, right, what we've been hearing we've been hearing from everybody, from the panelists, is what are the factors that influence how, they say they see and experience segregation. So the same question for you. What are the factors that influence how you see and experience segregation? And I know you've got you could do this, you could blow this up. What are the factors that influence how we see and experience segregation?
I want to thank Jane and Tonika again for wonderful responses and adding context. And I think for me, I'm most often coming from a point of view where I'm looking at structure and history. And so I unfortunately don't often look enough at individual contributions in ways that people either contribute to or really trying to disrupt and dismantle the effects of gentrification in my case, but segregation, right? They're related. But if we're thinking historically, and I think that's really important, I think about questions of segregation and these types of ideas, specifically in the United States, around Black people, as this question around containment and ways that Black people have been contained and had limited mobility and various restrictions placed upon us from the beginning. And so that's definitely expressed in Jane's film. But if we think about, a variety of regulations that didn't just start with redlining, prior to that, convict leasing or loitering laws that still go on, black codes, racial zoning, redistricting, redlining. And so redlining has become a term, I think, that's been used quite a bit. I'm hopeful that people know what it is, or at least the ways that the American state had perpetuated or produced these differences in terms of how Black people, for example, couldn't move into neighborhoods because they weren't receiving loans to be able to, one, refurbish their own homes because it had to be for new homes. But beyond that, the relationship between redlining, the inability to get loans, and then restrictive covenants, the inability to move into a neighborhood, made it so that you couldn't necessarily improve, the conditions of your living space, right? And then as a result, we see banks and mortgage lenders rejecting loans from people who were creditworthy, right? But because they couldn't necessarily use the money on their existing home, they were essentially left out, right? And so as a result, we already know the data shows, the hundreds of thousands of dollars of personal wealth that Black people have lost because of that inability to actually purchase in these neighborhoods and purchase these homes. So I've thought about that. I've written about it just in terms of my own family history and my family moving from Louisiana to San Francisco, and the ways that, what I didn't know was, until I talked to my grandmother, that they were forced, of course, to live in particular neighborhoods. I thought my family didn't have to live in the Bayview, Hunters Point, or Fillmore areas. I thought when they moved close to Daly City that was the first home they moved into. And my grandmother was like, oh no, we weren't able to move into any other neighborhood. And they were blockbusters when they moved into the neighborhood that they ended up in. And so there are these ways that, these waves of Black people who were moving to Northern, moving to Western, moving to Midwestern cities were still limited. We're still forced into particular neighborhoods, and it had a tremendous impact on our lifestyles, right? But you see this in architecture. You see this in large-scale public housing, right? And so if you think about, talking again about Chicago, Robert Taylor Homes, or thinking about Cabrini Green versus, the Levitt towns in New York and Pennsylvania, there's one in Puerto Rico, there's one more, New Jersey, right? So these Levitt towns that were subsidized by the federal government with these manicured lawns, every house got a television and appliances, right? But again, Black people couldn't move into the neighborhood. And so you have this cookie cutter American dream being carried out by the federal government, while at the same time, the inner city was crumbling. And it really created these disparate communities and opportunities that were lost. I do, yes, think about freeways and urban restructuring and suburbanization and the uneven geographies that came about because of them, because it still had a profound impact. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm looking at Oakland right now, and what that's really, I knew so little about Oakland, honestly, even growing up here. Of course, I knew about a lot of political activity, the radical politics, the incredible Black culture that was in Oakland, from Oakland, but I didn't know much about urban renewal. I didn't know much about the construction of the freeways. I didn't know much about how there was this theoretical shift that took place in Oakland in particular in the mid-20th century, where urban renewal went from this commitment to build affordable houses to this plan to really focus on revitalizing downtown in order to strengthen the tax base. And so as a result, you start to see where these cities are using federal funds to raise Black communities in order to support the growth of downtown and business people. And so what happens is you allow buildings to decay. You see this declining commercial infrastructure and industrial activity that's going on in these different areas, and it essentially pushes people out, right? And so in a lot of these cities, urban renewal was this opportunity to try to move white people back from the suburbs into the central city, but it didn't work, right? And so you see these cities starting to essentially cave as a result. Now, There are all kinds of programs that end up being, established to generate ideas to improve areas. But of course, one of them ends up being the construction of freeways. And they end up being these barriers, not only symbolic, but material barriers that exist between neighborhoods, that cut up neighborhoods. And you really see that, especially in the Midwest, but all over the country, where you can really kind of sit and think about, even BART, right? West Oakland BART station being built along a famously Black commercial corridor that was destroyed. So, in terms of the origins, it doesn't just start with the early and mid 20th century. It goes way before that. And the ultimate kind of experience, but then also in terms of how our society has been structured in this way to reduce the mobility, reduce access. And that comes about in so many different ways. And yes, just I did mention in our chat earlier about my critique of policy. And I know we can talk about that later, but just when we rely too much on policy, it prevents us from being able to not only combine this experiential quality that Jane and Tonika are talking about, but also understanding the structural implications of these racist practices that have fully been built into our institutions and honestly our ways of life. So we have to combat both of them at the same time in order for there to be some kind of change, honestly.
Great. Your answer relates to the next question about the causes and effects of segregation. All three of you have already remarked quite a bit, a little bit on both, especially the effects or the impacts of segregation. But let's take a moment out to really put a pin in this one, right? To really name what we need to name, to talk about the causes and the effects of these divisions. So, Jane, please, what about those causes and impacts?
Well, I think we've touched on so many things. I think that the inability for families to build wealth because of where they're, as Brandi's talking about, where they're forced to live and not being able to sort of, there's no upward mobility. If your house is worth less, when you sell it than it was when you bought it, things like that. And so, I think it's a huge part of it, but there's also this layering of, like every problem that you can think of right now that's going on, whether it's sort of climate collapse and gas leaks and the lack of tree canopy in certain neighborhoods, and those seem to be layered on the neighborhoods that were traditionally red line neighborhoods, and they're all next to the highways, and so that makes them even hotter, and so it's just sort of like one thing just gets built on top of another. And it's all over the country. At this point, I don't think there's a community anywhere where you don't see that layering of impact, and then you look and see who's living there, and it's usually not wealthy white people, right? So, so what do we do about that? I have no idea. I know we talked later about sort of like solutions. I don't have that, but the impact is pretty clear. It's just that the wealth gap is so disgustingly huge that there has to be intervention. There has to be some intervention there. And I feel like that's one of the main things that has to be tackled along with everything else. And I actually really love hearing both Brandi and Tonika talking about how it's got to become personal, and it has to become relational, and it has to become experiential, and it can't just be about policy. And so who gets to define the policy, I think, is where we need to go, the direction I think we need to go. How we get there, that's the harder question. Great,
thank you. Tonika, how would you tackle this question about causes and effects of segregation?
Well, one, I love to use my art and my platform to serve as an entry point for people to begin to understand these very large, complex issues that we feel one, so disconnected to, but also like it's just too big for us to like make some significant change. But there is power in just learning about it, because once you learn about history and how it impacts you or where you live, you can start to think of different solutions. Once you know all of the problems, it's information. And so really I think just making sure these kind of conversations happen on a larger, wider scale is one, but then also people understanding not only just how our government segregated our country, but to also understand the other ways in which they, because of the redlining and the segregation, how they made populations of color, specifically Black people, they made them vulnerable targets for greed. So outside of not being able to get a mortgage, outside of redlining, you also had so many Black families who would have been homeowners, who were taken advantage of the other discriminatory use of financial tools like land sale contracts. So even knowing the impact of that, and just to give you an idea of how knowing something like that can really open your mind as to how we can begin to solve these issues. I always had a question about Greater Inglewood. Like, our home ownership rate has always been like low. And I was like, why is that? Because that doesn't make sense compared to what I remember growing up. And then when I got old enough, I was able to find out the answer. A lot of the families would be homeowners in Greater Inglewood were actually sold their homes on land sale contracts. And so they had wealth extracted, that not the fact they weren't able to build it, but also stolen from them because these racist practices and policies made them vulnerable targets for people who were greedy. And so because of things like that, I was able to understand, oh, this is why my neighborhood never really had a high home ownership rate. That's why it has never happened. So because I learned that, now I want to create a movement to redress it. So not only, let's disrupt segregation, but let's also talk about redressing these things, correcting, not correcting through preventing further, but, people were stolen from. People were denied access to wealth and stolen from. There has to be some accountability. So that also for me is what needs to be part of the discussion. Laws and policies prevented the wrongdoings from continuing to happen, but they never truly addressed how it impacted people until stuff was made illegal. And so that's what I am really interested in, hoping that we can start to understand why that kind of conversation is necessary also. So everything just has to happen all at the same time. That's basically what I'm saying. Just all the movements, burn everything down, build everything up, all of it at the same time. You just gotta, we need new elected officials, and we also need different systems. We need just everything kind of like thought about differently. Just a big sweeping issue I have is just the commodification of homes. Like I've learned enough to the point where I'm like, that was actually a problem. That's, commodifying stuff like that. And then when I learn about things like land sale contracts, it connects me to understanding the culture and history of indigenous people. I'm like, there's such a huge connection between what indigenous people went through, being taken advantage of, stolen from, that the Black people in this country can connect to. Like we were treated the same, so all of those things just have to happen at the same time. And yeah, like Jane, I don't have one answer. I just know we just all got to do.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you. Brandi, so the question's about the causes and impacts of segregation. But I want to swing to one of the audience questions about DC statehood, given everything that you said as well about gentrification, right? Now, right, that DC is changing demographically, there's a push for statehood, not that, and so I'm sure the answer to that, to dealing with that question is going to be quite complex. So this is going to be unfair. Could you do this? Could you give us an answer to this? But could you do so briefly?
Oh, okay. So ironically, I was just asked, I got a call a couple of weeks ago about this, or someone was asking me about it, because I had written something briefly about the fact that I don't think DC is going to get statehood anytime soon. Now, there are scholars who do believe that this is a good time to think about it, given the makeup of the Senate and the House. Derek Musgrove is a professor at University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and he's written extensively about it. I think for me, I've been thinking about the fact that, despite the ways that Chocolate City is no more, fights over statehood, specifically for DC, have focused on whether the population was capable of self-governance. And so this isn't the first time that we've been talking about statehood in DC. DC residents voted for it. The issue is that DC is run by other people, right? And so DC doesn't have full control of its budget. DC doesn't have full control. There really is taxation without representation. And so to be honest with you, just anecdotally, I think until DC is not seen as a Black city anymore, it's not going to get statehood. Until it's not seen as something somewhere where a lot of Black people live or run it, it's not going to get statehood. That has been a justification for many, many, many years. So I would be hopeful. The other component is, what would it mean if DC were to become a state? How would Black people fare if DC became a state? And I'm not hopeful about that either. You are seeing the ways still that DC remains segregated. You see the ways that there's increasing militarization. You see the way increasing incarceration rates for Black folks. You see these ways Black folks aren't able to afford it. So what is statehood going to change? And I know you said quick, just really briefly. And thinking about what Tonika just said about, the commodification of housing, thinking about the financialization of housing, and these ways that, the state doesn't serve the same role anymore than it used to. Absolutely, we can talk meaningfully about reparations, we can talk about repair, but some of this so much is just that the 14th Amendment has not happened yet for so many people. And so we still have to even go back and think about where we still need to make folks whole before we even talk about the grievances and the repair that needs to happen. And I agree with the all at the same timeness that you sometimes have to tear it up in order to start over. But the issue that people have with these concepts around abolition in a variety of ways is that they don't feel comfortable dealing with a mess or dealing with an unknown without realizing that they're going to have something in the end. So I think that's certainly still the case. It still relates to statehood, but anyway, I'll be quiet.
No, thank you. That was great. I mean, it was unfair of me to make you answer that question. It's just a quick amount of time. So as we close out today, I want to make sure that each of you get the final word, right? So, and I know that the answer is all at onceness already to this question, but what do you see as a way forward, as viable, worker, fair, and equitable solutions? I mean, you can't give us the whole thing, right? And maybe just a little appetizer, a little moosh boosh of a policy recommendation. You know what I'm saying? Something to hold on to. So Jane, we'll start with you.
Well, judging by this panel, I would say Black women are the way forward.
Ooh, Jane.
I'm thinking about like Ferguson and Cori Bush, who's now the rep of Missouri, and Ayanna Pressley, who's now in Massachusetts, and Boston is about to have their first female Black mayor, and I don't know. That would be my short and sweet answer in terms of the all in oneness and all at the same timeness. I think that I'm hopeful, but I really don't. I'm not one of these people who has solutions. I wish I was. No,
thank you. Well, I like your idea of putting Black women in charge. That would be good. All right, so Tonika, right? All at onceness, right? Spaghetti on the wall. So what do you got, right? How do you see as the way forward?
Um, I see like very hyper local movements. Just how we saw during the pandemic, all of the hyper local protests that added up to something we'd never seen in our country, like protests in every state and then even worldwide. Like what? So I think us focusing on where we're from, where we live, where we exist, and really like putting our hands in the dirt where we are, and creating hyper local movements across the country to redress, or for all the things, that will have a lot of impact, because we've seen it raise awareness just during the pandemic. Those hyper local protests all added up to a major movement, and now it's in large media outlets. Just the term systemic racism, I swear it was not before all of those protests. So I just really think hyper local movements is something that we should focus on and help each other support, which is why I am thinking about ways to have my project be available and adapted to other places who want to use it as a tool to address segregation and create a bridge through it in wherever they live. And so I think that's how we have to support each other, lend each other help to those localized movements, and they will eventually add up to a national movement where we're all connected for the people who really want to see change and equity. We'll get connected and we'll be able to organize together. But it has to start local. It has to start personal and local.
Right, that's great. I mean, you said you didn't have anything. That's some amazing stuff, right? Hyper local activity. The relationality of everything that you're saying is just so amazing. It reminds me of King's reaction to the question of desegregation. He said, "Look, I don't want just formal desegregation. We need we need more than physical proximity. We need spiritual, civic affinity." And I think that's what you really, really speak to. Yeah. All right, Brandi, right?
Bring us home.
Bring us home, right? What do you see as a way forward, right? As a fair and equitable solution. A little, again, moosh boosh of some policy application, right?
Yeah. Well, see, goodness, I say every talk I give that I'm a trained sociologist, and we don't solve problems. We just identify them and tell you all about it and beat you over the head with it. So I think, but I want to go back to what Tonika was saying about the hyperlocal context. I think that's really important. Too often, I think we have been trying to look up and out rather than looking down and around. And there are opportunities. There are experts in our communities who really can determine the best way forward. And so too often we're trying to do a one size fits all. And in reality, those don't work. They haven't worked thus far. So Jane mentioning actually Cori Bush was on my mind because in one of her speeches, and I'm not sure if it was an acceptance speech or it was when she first came onto the floor, but she kept saying, I love you. I love you. She talked about love. And there's this way that, certainly you can think about interpersonal relationships and where love can be shown in that way. But I do think that we've got to come up with this structural impact of love. What does love look like? It looks like people being able to eat. It looks like people being able to live. Be warm in a home. We're experiencing this pandemic and evictions are still happening and more people are physically on the street than ever. And so we have to really try to think about what it does mean to love. How do we come together and produce an environment where people can absolutely live equitably? To do that, I think it means it's changing, honestly, our relationship to capital, changing our relationship to ownership, And also recognizing that we might need to have some impermanence rather than these permanent solutions. Since there's so much change that we have to really take stock and really learn again kind of how people function where we are. So that's been something that I've been grappling with myself in terms of my work. So much of kind of like the modern project was to focus on permanence, whether it be architectural structures, thinking again about policy. It's how much we rely on the Constitution, these permanent solutions to things when we know that time moves along, geographies change, people change, populations change. So we have to be able to change with those elements and actually come up with solutions that actually work. So I agree, hyper local, listen to Black women always, and just really kind of come up with some things that are malleable, right? That can really kind of prove how we can love each other.
Fantastic. I love that we're ending with a shout out to love, a shout out to agape, to civic love, to civic affinity. Remind us, like the theme of our festival is wisdom lives in our places, right? And there it is for everyone. There's the wisdom. All right. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Brandi. Thank you, Tonika, so much for your work, your just intensity, your life, and what you've done to for us today. All right, so thank you all. Thank you out there for the audience. And back now to Cristal. Sorry, Cristal, you're muted.
All right. Thank you so much to Tonika, to Jane, and to Brandi. That was one of my favorites. Thank you all for your work. We're so grateful to have had you. Thank you, Ron, to our amazing moderator. And what a great way to end the festival. We want to thank our audiences for joining us at the 7th Annual SF Urban Film Fest. As I said, this is our last virtual event for the season, but please subscribe to our e-newsletters and follow us on social media. We're at SF Urban Film Fest on everything. You'll get the latest updates on all upcoming events. We do things year-round, storytelling projects in community. Beyond the virtual festival events, if you are in the Bay Area, I'd like to announce a very special installation at Yerba Buena Center for the Arts called Morning is an Act of Love. This is a free, open to the public outdoor installation on the windows, walls, and walkways of the YBCA buildings in the Soma neighborhood of San Francisco. This is curated by our very own Susanna Smith, who will be joining us in a moment. We have photography up, interactive exercise called 36 Questions for Civic Love, and we're looping film projections that explore many of the same themes that we've been exploring together throughout the week. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome on the rest of the SFUFF team: Robin Abad, Susie Smith, Hannah Moore, Ron Sundstrom, me, and Omid Manocheri, and last but not least, Faye Darmawi, our executive director and founder. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. Absolutely. Next time in person.
Thanks, Cristal.
Thank you.